You're listening to BC Poly Talk. I'm Daniel Fontaine, your co-host.
And I'm Bill Tillman, your other co-host, and hopefully you're watching us too.
And on today's show, we have Ravi Kahlon, and Ravi is the Parliamentary Secretary for a very long Parliamentary Secretary post of Forest, Lands, Natural Resources, Operations, and Rural Development. So that covers a lot of areas, and we're going to be talking to Ravi today about forestry and much more. What's on your agenda, Bill?
Well, I definitely want to talk about ride sharing, which people are waiting for some time, and I think he'll have lots to say about that. I also think we'll hear something interesting from Ravi because he was on a tour to talk about anti-racism measures all across the province and heard some very amazing stories, I understand.
Yeah, and there are a number of other issues I'd like to talk about, including ride sharing, because he's from Delta, so I know that there's a lot of people in his community that are probably waiting for that ride share app to be working, so I'm going to be posing the question to him as to what's taking so long? Why don't we have ride share in BC?
Yeah, and I think we also want to talk about some of the topical issues of today, the coastal GasLink issue, where the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are trying to hold things up, and the recent decision on the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
And I'd like to just, in closing, kind of explore a little bit about the whole rural-urban divide when it comes to forestry, and actually resource development on the whole in British Columbia, and the fact that you've got these communities up island that are struggling right now, and you've got some folks in the lower mainland that might not be very connected to forestry. So I'm going to ask him that question as well.
Ravi Kahlon is our second guest on the show, and I'm looking forward to it.
So am I.
Welcome, Ravi Kahlon, MLA for Delta North, Parliamentary Secretary, Forest, Natural Resources, Lands, other stuff. It's a long title.
It was close. It was close. I don't even remember sometimes, so you did pretty well.
Well, we're really happy to have you here as our second guest on BC Poly Talk, and we're excited to talk to you. There's lots going on in BC politics, as there always is, but one of the questions that I have, which is, I think, on the minds of everybody who follows politics, is are we going to be in an election in 2020 with all of the strange goings-on with the Green Party, Andrew Weaver suddenly deciding to actually leave the party as well as step down as leader? Does this instability mean we might have an election?
Man, you guys don't mess around. I thought that was going to be some light conversation, maybe some easy topics right off the top, and asking about my family. But you went straight to it. Well, really, I mean, you guys are the pundits, so you guys will have a better sense of the punditry side of it.
We're as mystified as everybody else here.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is, Andrew. I've got a lot of respect for Andrew. A lot of respect for him, and a lot of people don't know this story. But it's when my mom immigrated in the early '70s to Canada. She washed dishes in a restaurant for 8 years. And then in early 2000, she ended up buying that restaurant. Well, that restaurant was owned by Andrew Weaver's in-laws.
Wow.
So they owned it when they gave my mom her first job, and then they sold her the restaurant when they retired. And so it's so we have this kind of a special bond. And so although we probably butt heads, maybe not the most for everybody, but we butt heads quite a bit. There's a heavy amount of respect there, and so I do believe that his, he's going through this tough time with his, wife being sick and then his own health, and so whatever he decides to do, I wish him well, and he's changed the game. I mean, he's going to be in the history books. The climate change plan that we've passed is historic. It's the leader in North America, and his fingerprints are all over that. And so I think he got into it because of climate change, and he gets to say when he decides that eventually he is done that he was an instrumental part of something historic. So
him sitting though as an independent must have raised some eyebrows in Victoria, because he could have stayed within the caucus and continued on. So there must be. We're trying to still figure out what the hidden message, if there is one, as to why he would sit as an independent. Any insight into that?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is that Andrew very much knew where he wanted the party to go to. And so the only thing I can assume is that he sees this thing going in a totally different direction. But that might not be the case. Again, it may be just because of family issues. And it's hard to speculate just because I don't know the dynamics of what's happening in there. I'll just say that I got a lot of time for Andrew, and he's done some amazing things. He's changed the game, as I said, and I wish him well in whatever decision he makes.
And we do as well, because it's, I think, always politics falls aside when someone's got personal health issues or in their family, whatever. And I think we've seen that with Tracy Reddy's and with other members, Lisa Bear and others in the legislature. Ravi, you're the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Forests. You've got a lot of stuff going on in that ministry right now. We've got the Western Forest Products dispute going on with steelworkers and Western Forest Products, obviously. We've also got just general challenges to forestry. How have you found in taking on this new role? What are the big issues for you?
Yeah, well, for me, my mandate letter is pretty clear. It's very interior focused. And so I didn't spend any time on the coast related issues just because I tried to stay in my lane. It's enough work to focus on the interior. So I did 3 rounds through the interior right when I got the file. In fact, some of the mayors chuckled that I might as well buy a place there because I was there so often. But it was tough. It's tough conversations. And I didn't shy away from it. I went and talked to people who lost their jobs. Talked to contractors who are losing their businesses, and they weren't the most friendly conversations. But you can't hide from these things, and so we went and we've had conversations, and we put the package together that I think has gone a long way. We've got people now going to job placement offices to find work. There's lots of job opportunities. The pipeline expansion and some work at Site C, and then there's a highway expansion project. So there's work trying to place people, but our number one focus was to stabilize these communities. I mean, the number one thing I heard from people was, I want my job. That's number one.
Yeah.
Second was, I want to stay in my community. Yeah. And so that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to stabilize these communities during a very difficult time. And now once we've kind of got to that place where we found some stability, it's where does the forest sector go from here? And we need changes. We can't have, in 2008, we went through this. We lost a lot of jobs. A lot of mills shut down. And now when I'm meeting people, they say, wow, I wish we'd done things in 2008. I wish we'd made changes that we needed to make in 2008. And I certainly don't want to hear people maybe 5-6 years from now say, wow, in 2017 and 18 and 19 and 20, we should have made changes. So we have to rethink how we do forestry. There is a better way. But I also don't like the other argument saying, well, we just stop forestry altogether, life will be so much better. I mean, I think people are just crazy.
Yeah.
So Ravi, you represent Delta North. So the last time I checked, there isn't a lot of forestry in Delta North. So how do you address the issue, like from an urban area? A lot of people in urban areas really don't make that connection to forestry, and you're from obviously an urban area. Yeah. How do you convince, or is that the right way to frame it? How do you get people in places like Metro Vancouver to actually make that connection of how important forestry is to the BC economy?
Well, I think you nailed it. I mean, I do have a mill in my community. And my dad worked in a mill. His first job here in Canada was working and he was an IWA member. And
mine too.
Really, and there you go. And a lot of stories are like that. And he lost his job. And my family went through a very difficult time when he lost his job. I was sent to India for 4 years without my parents. No FaceTime, no WhatsApp communicating, right? And so I've lived through what a mill closure means to a family. And so it's kind of personal. That being said, I think you nailed it, which is people sometimes, I feel, don't fully appreciate what forestry means to our economy in BC, what it means to the economy in Lower Mainland, and what it means to people that are living in forest-dependent communities. Even on the environmental question, people who live in forest-dependent communities are environmentalists. They might not want to call themselves that, but they care about their waters, they care about their forests, they care about where they go camping and where they spend time with their family. They just believe that you can make money and take care of the forest. Certainly we need to do a better job of it. I think that's what we've heard clearly, but it is possible to do so. And so I say to people all the time, go meet people in forest-dependent communities, talk to them. You'll find that they actually know a lot about what's happening in their backyard, and they want to see it done better. But they also want to they want to ensure that they can work and stay in those communities. And so we have to find that balance.
And it is a renewable resource. That's one of the things that people forget about. It's not like oil, which will eventually disappear, and natural gas and all these things. We can keep growing forests.
Yeah, and it's part of the climate change solution.
Yeah.
It's not something that's a part of the problem. I mean, we need to reforest more. We need to have a mixture of species. We need to do many other things in our planning processes. But, if you look at the way that building construction is changing, and the importance of forest products being used in cross-laminated timber and new buildings, and the new products that we're creating out of biofuels, and it's mind-blowing. And my perception of it when I was young, because my dad used to work in a mill and work on the green chain, it's not that anymore. You go in there now, it's high tech. Everything is high tech, and so the game is changing in the forest forest industry. I just don't think people here have fully understood that, and because it's not in their face every day. And so part of my role is to highlight that and make sure people
understand. And it used to be
understand.
such an enormous industry before in terms of employment, but also we had giant figures like Jack Monroe, the head of the IWA, who were larger than life and a friend of mine. Just one thing I want to ask you about further on the forestry question. As long as I can remember people talking in politics and public policy about forestry, that we got to do more value added, and yet it seems like we never quite get there. What's your sense of where we can go with forestry?
Well, I think from what I've heard from people who lived through the tough times in '08, that's what people were talking about then. But the markets turned real quick and people started making money again. And so that got kind of pushed off the side. And I think that now it's different. The allowable cut has come down huge, and now there's no choice. We have to go in that direction. Industry understands that, contractors understand that, workers understand that, and the communities certainly understand that. And so we're in a unique place in that all the kind of the pieces, First Nations, everybody understands that we can't do things the way we've been doing them. We got to do them differently, and those conversations have started. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to turn the ship in a positive direction, so we can continue to do this for a long time.
So how big do you think resource extraction as a whole, not necessarily just forestry, but we're talking about things like the TMX pipeline and the Coastal Gas Project. There's a lot of, BC is a very resource-based economy. Where do you see the NDP kind of going into the future in terms of resources? Because you've got this issue, as you mentioned, there folks primarily in urban areas where they just want to, in quotes, protect the environment. They don't want anything out of the ground. How do you balance that with the need to also create jobs and to export our resources?
Well, I mean, I'm with the NDP because I believe that we can do both. I believe there's a path to in reconciliation and protecting the environment and having jobs. I believe to my core that you can do that. If I didn't believe that, I'd join the Green Party. And if I believe that First Nations reconciliation doesn't matter, or workers' side doesn't matter, our environment doesn't matter, maybe I'd be with the BC Liberals, because I kind of feel that's what I hear from them all the time. So I think we're taking the hard path, which is sitting down with groups and working it out. It's not going to be easy. We hear about it in the news all the time, and the media loves to cover friction. But we're seeing lots of progress as well. And so maybe we're suckers for punishment, but I do believe this is the right path, and we're going to find a way through it.
Yeah, well, and the Green Party is looking for a leader, by the way.
Yeah,
if you do decide to join, you might as well go right to the top.
I don't think I'd be a good type of green leader,
but I know you too well.
Yeah.
One of the things I did want to talk about, you talked about your tour of forest communities. You also did a tour talking about anti-racism and those issues. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because it got some attention for sure, but I think there was probably a lot more to it than we heard.
Yeah, well, the Murdered and Missing Women's report came out, and one of the actions it was to have a conversation about racism through the province. And so I asked staff to help set it up. We ended up going to, we started in Comox, and we went to Nanaimo, Couch in Victoria. We went up to Prince Rupert, Prince George, Fort St. James. We were in, we traveled the province, let me put it that way. And it was an interesting experience. The amount of stories that I heard about people facing racism was more than I was expecting. But I also left very optimistic and positive because so many people showed up. And it shows me that, we have challenges, but we also have a lot of good people who want to see the thing go, province go in a more positive direction. So I actually left very hopeful, although I was hearing kind of negative stories. I left hopeful because we had elected officials show up, and just sometimes they'd be like, I didn't know these things were happening in my community. And so, and I would always say, well, first off, I'm glad you're here, because you heard it, and now you have a responsibility to do something about it. And so, my plan was to spend the summer doing that, and then I got the forestry file right at the end of my tour, and so I launched another tour. But I'm glad we were able to do it, and we announced soon after a new hub and spoke model to start to address that. And I'm hopeful that it's going to make a big difference in communities.
I particularly wanted to ask you because we've just had this past week or week and a half the situation with the Bank of Montreal office branch that had a Indigenous man and his granddaughter arrested, and now the bank has apologized profusely, I would say. But so it's still clear that this is in downtown Vancouver. It's not in some small town where there's perhaps more overt racism, but it seems a pretty sad example.
Well, I mean, it was BMO in this situation. but you can pick a name, and it could have been somebody else. And the reality is, and we know that it happens when people are accessing services from government too. I mean, nobody, maybe perhaps when you acknowledge it, you can actually start to address it. And when we had the poverty reduction strategy and Minister Jane Simpson did the rounds, in his report, he said racism is an issue when accessing social services. And so I even heard from a former chief who told me about a healthcare situation where she took her daughter to the hospital, and the nurse took her sweet time to help her, and then eventually said to her, have you been drinking? And it's like, I'm here for an emergency, and this is the first question. And so it happens. But again, I'm hopeful, and I believe we're making progress. And part of the solution is ensuring you have diversity on boards. So the Minister of Health has done an amazing job. He has First Nations representation on every single health authority in this province. Believe it or not, it wasn't there before. Even in my ministry, we've got frontline staff who are taking courses on reconciliation and First Nations, so it can help them in their daily interactions. And so I feel like we're making progress. And although BMO is getting beat up right now, and I don't know why the police would put a 12-year-old in the back. I just don't. That's a different piece altogether.
So Ravi, just switching gears a little bit, but staying on the same topic, federally, the federal government is trying to tackle its own issues with racism, and I know within the last, I think it's the last decade, they've shifted their whole hiring policy where they're now anonymizing people. So when people within the public service are applying for jobs, the research had showed that if you were a person that sounded like you had a South Asian name or First Nations, you may not even get that interview. Is that something, further to what you just talked about, is that something that the BC government itself would look at doing in its own shop? Is that something that would be of consideration?
I know that it's happening in some places, and I think it needs to happen more often. There was a Harvard study, I think it was like 5-6 years ago, where they did that. They put in 1,000 resumes for jobs, and 500 had Anglo names and 500 had non-Anglo names, and they found there was overwhelmingly people who had Anglo names that were getting interviews. So we know that the bias is there, whether it's intentional or not. It might not be, right? And so I think at the end of the day, every organization wants to have the best talent, and if you can find a way to ensure that the biases are taken out of it, but at the same time you're hiring the best and the brightest, I think it's a win-win for everybody. And so I'm glad the federal government's going in that direction, and I certainly hope our folks continue to go in that direction. And I recommend that to the private sector too, because at the end of the day, everybody wants talent, right? And so if your system is filtering some of that talent out inappropriately, you want to fix that. So.
Yeah. One of the issues we just passed over briefly, but I did want to focus a bit more on it as well. The Coastal GasLink situation, where the Premier John Horgan has said that the rule of law will apply, and I tend to agree, and that we have 20 First Nations along the corridor have all agreed, but we have hereditary chiefs who are unelected saying, no, wait a minute, we don't agree. How? And then, of course, the legislature unanimously passed the UNDRIP legislation, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So how, as a government, do you grapple with all those kind of challenging issues?
Yeah, well, you keep working at it. I think that's how you do it. And, it's a difficult situation, no doubt about it. And the Supreme Court has said that they've got permits and they can continue to do the work they need to do. People have the right to protest. I mean, I've got friends who protest. I've protested. But, you want it done in a peaceful manner. And that's what makes us special as a country compared to some parts of the world, where you can have your voice, and but you got to do it in a respectful, peaceful way. And so I know recently, there was a call to meet with government, but the Premier was meeting with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs last year. He went and met with them face to face. We've had government-to-government meetings monthly, every month since then. Perhaps not about the pipeline, but about a host of other issues. And so those meetings have continued, and I appreciate there's going to be a lot of rhetoric and people trying to drum up their issues and their case, but those conversations have been happening. I saw the Green Party's release just recently on that as well, and they, as far as DRIPA goes, they acknowledge that it's the purpose of it was forward-looking. How do we change the way government's relationship with First Nations is going forward, not to relook? Even Regional Chief Terry Teegee acknowledged that the legislation wasn't a veto. He said it in his statement in the legislature. And so, these issues sometimes become the main issues, but we're going to keep working at it. We're going to keep having conversations. And again, I'm hopeful. And if I wasn't, I wouldn't be doing this job. So.
And I guess, just sorry, Dan, I'm just going to follow. I guess the question I have, because this is BC Poly Talk, is there a political opening for a party that obviously is not Liberal, Green, or NDP, perhaps BC Conservative or something that might come along, to say, well, we don't agree with UNDRIP. We think that this has gone too far, and try and carve out some of what I would call the right wing and particularly rural vote. And I mean, you wonder in some of the forest industry communities and others whether that might have some appeal that could cause some kind of a rupture within BC politics.
Well, that kind of rupture was happening in the BC Liberal Caucus. I mean, when this thing was brought forward, you had members walking out of their chambers. I'm surprised some of them even showed up to vote because you could see they were visibly angry about it. Yeah. And so it certainly is a fault line within their universe. And I think that Andrew Wilkinson's struggling to keep this tent together because they have people who fundamentally disagree on issues. And so, yeah, you're right. There definitely is an opening. And there's people out there. I mean, I have people in my community who've come on and said, I'm totally against what you guys are doing on that. Mm-hmm. Fair on you. People have the right to their opinion, and I certainly know that it's there. And you're right, BC Conservative Party, if that's their view, would have an opening to have that conversation. But I certainly hope that most people understand that this is correcting historical injustices and that it's the right thing to do. But not everybody will always agree.
Yeah.
Now, you've been criticized, you being government, actually the Minister of Forest in particular, from the BC Liberals around having the Minister of Forest go up to that region and to actually interact with the hereditary chiefs. And Minister, I think, has clarified on the record that he was merely bringing some food or something. What motivated the Minister to do that? Because it does open up the door for people to say that maybe the government's having it both ways. The Minister's sympathetic to the hereditary chiefs, but the government itself's not taking that position.
Well, as an MLA, your job is to talk to your constituents. And if he has constituents there, that's his responsibility, whether they agree with him or whether they don't. I meet with people who I don't agree with, and they don't agree with me, being in the office, but I meet with them. And so I find that criticism quite hilarious, to be honest with you, to criticize somebody, to go and talk to somebody who's got a difference of opinion. Perhaps if the BC Liberals did more of that, they would be in government still. But they forgot that that's what they're elected to do. And so we're going to continue to do that. I think the minister has all the rights to go and talk to people he represents, and I think he should be doing that.
One of the reasons I think the BC Liberals aren't in government is they didn't move on ride-sharing. Yeah. And that's one of the big topics that we've had. Your government, the NDP government, and John Horgan have said, we're moving on it. We were going to have it by this Christmas, but it was, of course, in the hands of the Passenger Transportation Board, which is an independent body. Yeah. So how are you guys grappling with it's gone into the system, and you have no idea when it's going to come out? Yeah,
well, that's the power of being an independent body. They get to decide when they want to and how they're going to make those decisions. We can just certainly hope that they make thoughtful decisions and learn from other jurisdictions. I do find it comical hearing BC Liberals talk about, how they would have done so great with this file. But, we've passed all the legislation pieces. We had to change lots of legislation to make this a reality. ICBC pieces are in place. So the pieces are in place. The PTB just needs to make some tough decisions. And I think the amount of companies that applied, I think, is what surprised the PTB. Yeah. I mean, most people thought it was going to be one or two companies, the big two. And now you have, I think, 8 or 10 companies applying. I think no one expected that kind of uptake. And so I hope the PTB gets it right. I hope they're thoughtful about learning the lessons from other jurisdictions, whether it's around congestion or whether it's about people making a decent wage. And, I am here as my dad was a taxi driver, and so I'm here because he drove every night and made money, so I could do all the things I did in my life. And so my concern as a person is not about share values or a company this or company Y or some major company coming to make money here. It's about drivers and how are these drivers going to be able to provide for their kids. And so as long as the PTB addresses those things, I'm happy with whatever comes out of it.
Well, I think both the BC Liberals and the BC NDP have had a kick at the can in terms of ride sharing. We're still waiting, so we still don't have it at the time of this taping. Who knows? It might be. I might walk out the door today and I might actually be able to work on my app. But one of the areas that I think you differ from the BC Liberals Liberals is that I think they're on record as saying that they're open to with Class 5, and you guys have gone to Class 4, which if you look and listen to all the ride-sharing companies, they'll tell you that's incredibly problematic. How do you respond to those critics who say that you guys have just put a really big hurdle in the way of ride-sharing in BC?
Well, ride-sharing companies are, at the end of the day, going to try to get maximum value. I mean, they tell you they can't do Class 4, yet they're operating in markets where they have Class 4. Halifax, in fact, is now going to Class 4. They tell you can't have caps. Well, guess what? New York has caps. They criticize companies that have taxis on their app, but they themselves in Japan have their app open to taxis. And so they're going to do what they got to do to try to get maximum benefit and the lowest amount of restrictions as possible. But it's all rhetoric, because when they really want to do it, they can do it. And they've shown that they've done it in other jurisdictions. New York has caps. I mean, people don't even understand that. But what does that mean? At the end of the day, you press a button, a car shows up. I don't think the general public cares about that kind of talk. I think they just want to be able to get a convenient car when they press a button.
Would you extend that though, Ravi? You don't, for example, there's other organizations, like other community organizations that drive people around, and they have to do essentially similar work to the folks at Uber. Would you require them to have Class 4 as well? Because right now you wouldn't. So how do you respond to like Meals on Wheels and other groups that have to drive?
Well, I think if you're not doing it to make a profit, if you're a nonprofit and trying to do something good for your community, we have to have some flexibility, because they're not trying to make a money off it. They're trying to do something positive for the community. But if you're trying to make a profit, then I think you need to have those scrutinies in place. You need to have the defense, the safety in place, so that people feel comfortable when they get in that thing. So into the car, and so that's my view, anyways. And the PTB is independent; and they're going to decide where they go from here.
Yeah, I said Meals on Wheels, but I meant the
I have no idea what you meant.
No, I didn't. I said I had Meals on Wheels, but I'm thinking of the New Year's Eve stuff where the drivers. I can't remember the name of the company.
Operation Red Nose. Operation Red Nose.
Now you have the Red Nose.
Now I have Red Nose because I got Meals on Wheels.
I have one more question.
Yeah, sure.
So you're not only you're one of the youngest members in the legislature, but you also came from the back room, working with Adrian Dix when he was party leader, and when we first met, probably. To the front room. How have you found that transition, and also being a young member of the legislature?
Well, I feel like I know less. When you're working in those rooms, you know everything.
Yeah.
Everybody.
You have to.
Somebody sneezed, and you know that they sneezed, and so I joke that I worked for Adrian Dix. For many years, I worked for the Premier when he was opposition leader, and I joked that I started my own franchise. And so I really enjoy being an MLA. I really enjoy, my favorite part is talking to people in my community. I could literally stay in my community office and have people come in all day long, and that part it's very special. Not always positive, sometimes people have negative things to say, but it's always interesting and good to have that debate. And so I enjoyed the work I did. I believed in the work I did for both Minister Dix now and the Premier of the opposition. And we're able to show all that work we did was for a reason. And we've made improvements on healthcare, on the environment, on First Nations reconciliation, everything that I was hoping that we'd be able to do, we were making progress on. And so it was well worth it.
Great. Any advice you'd give to other young British Columbians who are thinking of maybe getting into politics, now that you've been doing this for a few years? For anybody who's listening who might be thinking about getting into provincial politics? Yeah,
well, I would say that if you have a young family, talk to people who are in politics, have young families. It's hard. It's really hard. I've got a partner who does amazing work, who essentially is doing her job and taking care of my son, and so I'm an absent parent in many ways, and so you need to have that family support. You have to have an understanding of what you're getting into. But I always say to people that are interested, do it if you believe in what you're doing. If you want to just have your name in the newspaper, don't do it. If you are looking for a job, don't do it. Do it because you think you want to do something better for your community, because then you'll find it's much easier to get the job done. But if you're there for anything else, it's a painful ride, especially if you don't like it after a few months. It's really difficult. And I see some of the faces across the way, and I see how unhappy they are, and I don't want to be that way. And so the day that I'm not feeling like I'm making a difference, I won't be doing this, and I'll do something else.
No, I wasn't going to raise this, but the Premier did. He said there was going to be talk of a cabinet shuffle or something.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I couldn't leave this interview without asking you. I mean, you are on probably a very small handful of names of people that Bill and I have talked about that could be potentially going to cabinet. Has the Premier phoned you? Has he left you a message?
Yeah,
break some news.
Is there any breaking news?
Breaking news here. No, I haven't got a phone call from anyone, and to be honest, I'm indifferent. I do the work anyways, and I joke. I act like a cabinet minister even though I'm not. So I just go and do the work I want to do, and it's tough putting a cabinet together. I've been on staff where it's potential conversations are happening. I've seen the decisions and how they're made, and so whoever gets put in is going to do a good job. If it's me, I'd be happy to do the work. If it's not me, I'll continue to do what I'm doing. So I'm different.
Thank you for being our second guest, and whether you're a cabinet minister or not, we hope you'll come back.
I'm back anytime you want, and I'll next time I'll bring some breaking news for you.
We really appreciate it. Ravi Kahlon, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ravi.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
And we're back after talking with Ravi Kahlon. Daniel, I thought that was quite fascinating. A lot of different aspects of that. Ravi's an impressive guy and certainly somebody who knows a lot about a lot of different things. I particularly enjoyed the conversation about ride sharing, a number of things that I didn't know before that are quite important facts, so like the idea that there's a cap on the number of ride shares in New York City, probably the biggest market they have. And then also on the forest industry, a lot of things going on in the forest industry, a lot of challenges.
No, I enjoyed that part on the forestry because I think that's not been explored very much around the whole issue of the fact that there are folks outside the Lower Mainland that are living and breathing forestry, need it to put food on the table, and yet in urban areas it just doesn't. It's not very topical. People aren't talking forestry or mining or resource industries, period, in the Lower Mainland. So his being able to make that connection back and saying how important it is to our local economy in Metro Vancouver that we support resources, I think that was a fascinating part of the discussion.
Yeah, and people do tend to forget in this city, particularly in downtown Vancouver, we are in Metro Vancouver, that the forest industry, the mining industry, other natural resources, oil and gas, and liquefied natural gas are all a huge part of our economy and also provide revenues that fund our schools, our hospitals, our roads, our entire way of life.
Yeah, and I can definitely see why the Premier put him as the Parliamentary Secretary with a very long title. He really seems to have a grasp on that file. He really seems to be passionate as well about forestry, which is important in that role. So yeah, that was my takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Great show. And remember, you can find everything at our website, bcpolitalk.ca. You can also chase us down on Spotify and iTunes for podcasts. You can find us on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook and find links there. You can go to YouTube and see the show.
You've been listening to BC Poly Talk. I'm Daniel Fontaine. Thanks for tuning in.
I'm Bill Tillman, and thanks also.